I'm not sure how many of our listeners know that I went to school to be a Spanish teacher, and I have a real passion for the language and the culture of all the Spanish-speaking countries. And because of this, the next two episodes are an extra special treat for me, as Mr. Fiddler describes what it was like to immerse himself in the culture of Mexico City and shares his observations of the people and their way of life in the 1950s. Thanks yet again for sharing another piece of history with us. I know that when you were learning your trade, they would have you working in different departments so you would know how to do everything. Last time we talked, you mentioned how the textile industry was undergoing major changes, and so were you in a way. You received several transfers, first to the milling department, and then you got transferred somewhere else. Can you tell us which department you were transferred to and what that experience was like?
Yeah, towards the last half of 1954, I was transferred to the Barometric department to be an inspector. I don't think that it paid any more, but it was on day shift, and it was a welcome surprise. There were two other inspectors in that department, Paul Ireland and John Fiddler. Paul was the first part inspector who checked the first part of the production line to ensure that everything was right. John was much older than me and had been at textile almost most of his life. I had never met him before, but we discovered we were very distant cousins. He also had a twin brother working in the same department. John and I worked side by side, making sure that following the first inspection, everything was all right. We circulated through the department and inspected parts as they came off the various machines. Many things could go wrong with the machines, and then the parts became scrap. It was a pretty interesting job, and I got to meet a lot of different people. While I was working in the Barometric department, I ran across an interesting situation. One of the jobs I had was inspecting needle barb arms that were used in the knitting machines. These arms had 2 half-inch holes bored through them with a very close tolerance. They wanted to hold the size of the hole to a half-inch, plus or minus 0.2 of a thousandth. To check the holes that closely, we used an air gauge, which was on a hose with a probe in the end that we slid into the hole, the half-inch hole. There were 2 tiny holes in the probe that let the air pass through it, and the closer the fit in the hole around the profile was lessened and passed through. The amount of an air passing through the probe showed up on a gauge controlling a float inside a glass tube. The float had to stay within a designated lines, and if it didn't, the part was thrown away as scrap. When I saw what they were doing, I really had to laugh. The reason for this was that when I was out on the road building knitting machines with Sam McPherson, we got bulletins from Textile telling us about the same things to look for. I clearly remember one that referring to this particular hole bar arm. It stated that before we assembled them to the machine, we should make sure to take a reamer and run it through those particular holes a couple times to make them a little bigger. Evidently, they were having a lot of trouble with arms freezing up after the machine was running. And while we were in the shop throwing away good arms because they were a little big in those holes. Right away, I went to the foreman and explained the situation. He went and checked it out and discovered that I was right. And after that, they did away with the air gauge. They should have given me a bonus because I really saved them a lot of money. I never even got a thank you.
Oh my gosh, well, wow.
Yeah, that was something.
I would have been pretty PO'd.
Maybe that's why I decided maybe I'll get out here pretty soon.
Well, I know you didn't get a bonus, but I know you were hoping for a raise. Can you tell us about that story?
Sure. As time went by, I became a little unhappy. Working in the shop, I would have sooner been out on the road building knitting machines, but of course, there weren't that many jobs available. Shop work didn't pay well, too, either. I decided to go to see the personnel director, Mr. Fleischman, about asking for a raise. When I asked him, he said, "My God, you're already getting more than anyone else in the department." Then I explained that I didn't see how that could be possible because the man working right next to me was John Fiddler, and that he was there much longer than I was. He said yes, and he is getting a nickel an hour less than you are. After a little more discussion, he asked me how much I was earning per hour, and I told him $1.99. He said, "Well, I'll give you $2 an hour, and that's the best I can do." Well, you can imagine how that made me feel.
Wow, what a letdown. That's kind of a slap in the face.
Soon after that, I decided to talk to Mr. Duff, who was in charge of the erectors. I eventually got to talk to his secretary and told him how I felt and asked him if there wasn't anything available out on the road right now. I told him there wasn't. I would have to look around for something else. The following Monday, I was called over to the office, and he asked me if I could leave for Mexico by the following Friday.
Wow, was that what you were expecting when you said on the road?
I was a big surprise. Of course, I said yes.
Wow.
While I was in the office, a textile serviceman by the name of Bill Marshall stopped in to see Mr. Benz. He handled Mexico and South America, and when he found out I was going to Mexico, he told me to get a haircut before I left because the barbers weren't too good down there.
Oh, wow. What sort of stuff did you have to do in order to prepare for your trip on such short notice?
I was busy that week. I had to get a letter from the police department stating that I never was arrested or had a record. I had to go to Philadelphia to get a working permit for Mexico, as well as get a passport. The worst part was when we found out that Betty wouldn't be able to go along because she was pregnant.
Oh, wow. What was the rationale for that?
The airlines would not take passengers after they were so many months along on their pregnancy. Also, about this time, she developed phlebitis and had to stay off her legs as much as possible. I finally left Reading on Saturday, January 29, 1955. I took a train to New York City and checked into the Peter Cooper Hotel.
So at this point, you run into somebody from last week's episode.
Yeah, I did. I decided to try to look up at his brother, buddy who was living in Greenwich Village, and after walking about 20 blocks, I found him. We talked a little while, and when he finally remembered me, we went across the street to a bar and had a couple of bottles of beer. We talked for about 2 hours, and then I decided I'd better get back to the hotel. I caught a cab back to the hotel, and then I talked to Betty on the phone. Before I went to bed, I told her about my visit with Buddy and how we talked about his paintings and upcoming shows.
And was that the last time you saw Buddy?
Yeah, that was the last. I thought I was the last one ever seen him, but I realized later, while I was gone, he and his wife visited his parents.
Oh.
They're the last ones to see him.
Okay. So you were about to head off to Mexico City.
Yeah.
Que bien.
Hmm?
I said que bien. How good. So what can you tell us about your trip?
Wow. That could take a while.
All right.
On Sunday, January 30th, I took a cab at 9:30 in the morning out to the Idlewild Airport that later became the Kennedy Airport. Since I hadn't traveled much by air, except in the Navy, I was quite impressed with the airport. Keep in mind that it was 1955 and it was fascinating seeing airlines from so many different countries and to see and hear so many people of different nationalities. I flew on a big, shiny new Air France plane that came from Paris and was going to Mexico City non-stop. The nice part was that I was flying first class, where the seats were spacious and the service was great. We had a great flight. The weather was perfect and the food was something else. They served cocktails before the meal, champagne, and dinner and wine, with one dessert. Later we enjoyed tea and cookies. It was a real treat.
How did you end up in first class?
Well, I had a good job.
Wow.
Not everybody goes to
Mexico first class in 1955. Well, you're always lucky, so no surprise there.
Yeah, my luck's still following along. We arrived in Mexico City about 8:20 Eastern Standard Time, and it took me about 1.5 hours to get through the red tape of immigration. Roy Lape, the fellow that I would be working with, and his wife met me at the airport. They seemed like very nice people, and they brought me to the Hotel Geneve. I believe they might have been about 15 or 20 years older than I was. They got me checked in and got a room about as big as our bedroom at home, with a private bathroom, shower, wash bowl, and toilet. It was nicely furnished and cost 35 pesos, which amounted to $2.80 in American dollars. It also had a phone, and the place seemed very clean.
All right. Can you tell me a little bit about Roy and his wife?
Roy and his wife arrived several weeks earlier in their brand new 1955 Chevrolet that they had driven down from the United States. They told me that when they crossed the border into Mexico, they had to pay quite a large deposit of money that they would get back when they left Mexico with the car. I guess this was to discourage them from selling the car while they were in Mexico. My tools arrived on a large plane, and that Monday morning we had to go back to the airport and pick them up on the way to work. We spent our work days at the plant, Media Perfecto, was the name of the plant. We also drove to work with Roy's car. It wasn't a bad drive because it only took 15 or 20 minutes. A lot of women were out early sweeping their sidewalks, and they usually wore a mask over their nose and mouth for protection from the dust. There weren't many traffic lights, but at some of the big intersections there were platforms in the middle of the intersection with a policeman standing on it, directing traffic. However, most of the intersections didn't have traffic lights or policemen. The first car in the intersection went providing you had enough horn and a little nerve. It was amazing that there weren't more accidents.
Well, it sounds like you were taking careful observations of the local culture. What else were you seeing on your morning drives?
Sometimes we saw fellows riding bicycles with enormous baskets filled with baked goods on top of their heads. Once in a while, they dropped a basket full in the street and stopped to pick up the baked goods and be on their way. We also saw people delivering milk on bicycles.
So it sounds like you and Roy got into a little routine since you guys were commuting to work together. What can you tell me about that?
Since Ray had already started to work there a week or so before, right before I arrived, we followed the schedule. We started working at 7, so we had to get up early. We ate breakfast at the hotel, and Roy told me he had discovered that the hotel kitchen made lunches for the Air France airline every day. So we talked them into making lunches for us too. They also fixed us a thermos of cold water to take along to work. The only drinking water they had at the plant was a big 5 or 10 gallon bottle of spring water, or at least they said it was spring water. At noon, we usually went back to the hotel to eat our lunch. Roy had his with his wife, and I usually ate in my room. The plant had about a dozen machines running, and we were building 2 more. They received the 2 new machines completely torn down and packed in boxes, so we had about a half a dozen young fellows helping us. It was mostly their job to unpack everything with our supervision and then to clean everything because most of the parts were covered with cosmoline, a protective coating to keep them from rusting. The interesting part was that none of them spoke a word of English, and we didn't speak any Spanish, but we got along fine with sign language, and it wasn't too long before we started to pick up some Spanish. They were all very young, and they got paid about 6 or 7 pesos a day. That amounted to about $1 a day in our money, and that was for a 10-hour day.
Wow.
I believe the knitters were paid more because they were strong union workers.
Wow.
If the electricity went off for a while and didn't come back on within an hour, they went home for the rest of the day and got paid for it. It wasn't coming for the power to go off, and Roy and I checked to see what was causing it. We discovered that they were using circular fuses, and we could rotate it to the next setting. It was good for 6 different positions. A couple times we found out that someone took the fuses out and put a copper coin to places on the other. That certainly wasn't a safer thing to do. The plant was relatively clean, and the people were very friendly. The owners were only ones who spoke English, and they didn't show up much. We worked 10 hours a day and about 6 to 8 hours on Saturday.
Even the weekend, too?
Yep. During the week, we worked 7 to 12 and then went back to the hotel for lunch and then worked from 1 to 6. After work, we went back to the hotel, took a shower, and then Roy, his wife, and I would go out to eat dinner around. Most of the Mexicans took a siesta after the noon meal and then worked late and ate dinner late, like about 8 or 9 in the evening. We rotated restaurants so that we got a variety of food. And there were a lot of good restaurants within walking distance of the hotel. We enjoyed dinners from around the world, including French, Swiss, and Italian food.
Wow, I'm surprised that there was French and Swiss food down there.
Oh, they had all kinds.
Really?
Even Mexican.
Oh, you're funny. Well, it sounds like you were having a really great time. And I think we're going to talk a little bit more about this in next week's episode. This is Marley and the Ping Jockey signing off.
Bye-bye.